In this video, I'll be showing you the 10 weirdest murder cases of all time. Number 10. The murder of Renee Hardel. While some visits could be so memorable and interesting, others could be life-ending. And of course, weird, as we would see in this story. Renee Hardel was a Dutch student at the Sorbonne University in Paris. On June 11, 1981, she paid a visit to the apartment of her classmate, Issei Sagawa, where she met a brutal end. Sagawa was a foreign student from Japan who had developed cannibalistic desires from a young age. A human cannibal? Yeah, we do have some. At least Sagawa was one. Once in his house, Sagawa killed Hardel and then proceeded to consume parts of her body. He was arrested 4 days later, but declared mentally unfit for trial and deported to his home country, where he was eventually released due to legal loopholes. That was not so good a news from Japan. He quickly capitalized on his notoriety and became a celebrity of sorts, and making public appearances. Sagawa lived as a free man till his death in November 2022. Number 9. I70 Strangler. This probably sounds like the name of a highly digitized, sophisticated weapon. I mean, it's I70. We probably should have seen I69 just a few years before, and its updated and advanced model is what we now have as I70. But for the Strangler attached to its name, it could have easily been a gadget. But shockingly, it's neither a gadget nor a weapon. I70 Strangler is the nickname of an unidentified serial killer who had all his victims' bodies discovered in areas alongside Interstate 70. The reason for the I70 nickname: between 1980 and 1991, the bodies of 12 men and boys were found along the Interstate 70 highway. The crimes were attributed to one individual, referred to as the I70 Strangler, as all 12 victims were killed by strangulation. Most of the victims were last seen in or around popular gay bars and other similar establishments within a 4-block radius in Indianapolis, leaving with an unidentified man. Typically, the killer chose young boys and adolescents whom he met in popular gay bars as his victims. All of them were later found naked or partially clothed near Interstate 70, often dumped in rivers, streams, and ditches in the rural countryside. Police investigation produced a list of suspects, most notable of which was Herb Baumeister. In 1996, police found the remains of 11 men on Baumeister's property in connection with a seemingly unrelated string of murders. Before he could be arrested, Baumeister took his own life, leaving many to believe, albeit with very low certainty, that he was the I70 Strangler. Another, more viable suspect was convicted serial killer Larry Eyler, who was found guilty of murdering 21 adolescent boys and young men in Indiana and Illinois, and was on death row at the time for the 1986 murder of 16-year-old Daniel Bridges, one of the victims of I70 Strangler. However, there were inconsistencies in the modus operandi of Eyler and that of the I70 Strangler. Eyler's killings occurred over a year, and he killed his victims with a knife, while the I70 Strangler's victims were strangled over a period of 11 years, making Herb Baumeister the likelier suspect. And it gets even weirder. Number 8. The murder of John Price. Do you remember Margaret Thatcher, the first female prime minister in Britain's history and even the whole of Europe? In fact, she remains Britain's longest continually serving prime minister, being the only British prime minister to win 3 consecutive terms in the 20th century. What about Kamala Harris, the first female vice president and the highest-ranking female officer in the United States, as well as the first African American and Asian American vice president? But there's another female history maker in Australia you hardly know about. She is the first female in the history of Australia to be sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. Oh yes, she's a history maker too. The murder of John Price by Catherine Knight is still regarded as one of the most gruesome murders in Australian history. Long after her husband deserted her, Knight struck a romantic relationship with Price and later moved in with him. Having had enough of her violent behavior, Price kicked Knight out of his house like a goalkeeper would do during a goal kick, only for her to return on the night of February 29, 2000. A return like a thief in the night. While he was asleep, she stabbed him an astonishing 37 times, severely mutilated his corpse, skinned him, and then put his skin on a meat hook, which she had recently installed. She then cooked his head and parts of his body with the intention of feeding them to Price's adult children with potato, pumpkin, beets, zucchini, cabbage, squash, and gravy. What an abominable delicacy. Sadly for her, she was stopped by police after Price's co-workers called the police, as he had not been at work that day. It turned out that she had been so dangerous and violent that Price had told his co-workers that if he ever went missing, it was because Knight had killed him. Perhaps a better notice from Price would have been calling the police himself when she earlier attempted to stab him in the chest. After receiving a call from Price's colleague, police found Knight in his house and arrested her. She became the first woman in Australia to receive life imprisonment without parole and is currently imprisoned at the Silverwater Women's Correctional Center in New South Wales. Number 7. The death of Candice Newmaker. Born Candice Elmore, this young girl was adopted by Jean Newmaker after being removed from her biological parents due to neglect. But she wasn't only neglected, she was coming into Jean's life with severe trauma from an abusive home. Her mother was a teen and her father was abusive. What would you expect from such a child who also had to act as a motherly figure to her 2 younger siblings as well? As a result, Newmaker had a hard time adapting to her new environment. But it wasn't just about Jean. Before arriving at Jean's house, she had been moved between a number of different foster homes, where her rebellion and anger led to her exit from those homes. Jean wasn't like any of the other caretakers, however. Rather than quit, she put more efforts. Sadly, the efforts would eventually lead to something more tragic. After making her findings, she learned about a condition called reactive attachment disorder, in which a child is incapable of bonding with a caretaker, often because of abuse or neglect at early stages of development. Newmaker had once started a fire in their home and had even forced sexual acts on 2 other girls, threatening to hurt them if they reported. Yes, it was that bad. And maybe badder as well. Believing Newmaker was dealing with this, Jean sought the help of multiple talk therapists who weren't able to solve the lingering problem until she met an unlicensed psychologist named Connell Watkins, who specialized in attachment disorder, conducting a new form of therapy known as rebirthing. On April 19, 2000, during the rebirthing session, Candice was covered in pillows and blankets, held down and forced to fight her way out to her adoptive mother. Completely restrained by the weight, the young girl was gradually smothered to her death. As a result, Watkins was convicted of criminal charges and sentenced to 16 years in prison. Jean, on the other hand, accepted a plea deal in exchange for a 4-year suspended sentence. After Newmaker's death, a law known as Candice's Law was instigated in Colorado, North Carolina, prohibiting treatments like the one that killed Candice. Hold on right there. The deeper we go, the more interesting it is. And we're on the 6th weirdest murder case. But which case have you enjoyed best? Let us know in the comment section. Number 6. The Janet DePalma case. Janet's case wasn't only shocking and devastating, but it also had some spiritual connotations, making it one of the weirdest on the list. I mean, who wouldn't find spiritual stuff weird? And probably scary too. Janet DePalma was last seen alive on August 7, 1972, after telling her parents that she was heading out to a friend's house. It would take 6 weeks for her decomposing remains to be found on a cliff known as the Devil's Teeth in her small town of Springfield, New Jersey. What made this case particularly disturbing is that her remains were reportedly discovered in the midst of a group of objects that were deemed occultic. It is generally believed that the remains were found inside a coffin-shaped perimeter of fallen branches and logs, and inside the perimeter were several small makeshift wooden crosses, while others claimed the remains were found lying on a pentagram, surrounded by mutilated animal remains. Also, no signs of injuries or fractures were found on her body, which led authorities to conclude that she had died due to strangulation. In the following weeks, many began suspecting that DePalma had been the victim of a satanic sacrifice. Despite these claims, the question of who killed Janet DePalma remains unanswered. Early in the investigation, Springfield police received a tip regarding a homeless man living in the woods near the quarry. The man was known to locals simply as Red, and it was alleged that he fled his campsite in the woods shortly after DePalma went missing. While this lead initially looked promising, the Union County Prosecutor's Office ultimately decided that Red had nothing to do with DePalma's death. Investigators continued to attempt to find leads, but due to a lack of tips from the public, along with inconsistent stories told to the police by her family, friends, and peers, the case eventually went cold. Number 5. The Crimes of Dennis Nielsen. The weirdest fact about Dennis Nielsen was that he was both a noble murderer and ignoble murderer. Maybe you didn't get that. He was both a member of the army and a serial killer. Born in Scotland in 1945, Dennis Nielsen moved to London as an adult and joined the army as a chef. Nielsen became known as the Muswell Hill Murderer, as he committed his latter murders in the Muswell Hill district of North London. While living there, Nielsen would lure men to his apartment with the promise of food or shelter before taking their lives. In total, he was responsible for at least 12 deaths, although his actual victim count is believed to be even higher. Nielsen would keep the bodies in his home for weeks, often engaging in lewd acts with them before dissecting and disposing of the remains by burning them in a bonfire or flushing them down the toilet. He was eventually caught in 1983 after a plumber found human remains in the pipes following complaints about a blocked drainage. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison, where he died in 2018. He died at the York Hospital on 12th of May 2018 of a pulmonary embolism and a retroperitoneal hemorrhage, which occurred following surgery to repair an abdominal aortic aneurysm. We've come this far together. Trust me, we can go even farther beyond this video. And that's by you liking and subscribing to this YouTube channel right now. Thank you. Now we move on to an even weirder murder case. Number 4. The Crimes of Tamara Samsonova. While many would say charity begins at home, to Tamara Samsonova, murder is what begins at home, as she started her 15-year crimes with the murder of her own husband. Also known as the Granny Ripper, Tamara Samsonova is reported to have committed a series of gruesome murders between 2000 and 2015. Her first alleged victim was her husband, who she reported missing in 2000 and who has never been found dead or alive. After her husband's disappearance, Samsonova began renting out a room in her house and is believed to have murdered several of her tenants. She would then dismember their bodies and dispose of them around her city of St. Petersburg, Russia. The most tragic of them all, that would eventually be her last murder, was that of Ulanova. In March 2015, Samsonova met 79-year-old Valentina Nikolaevna Ulanova, who also lived on Dimitrov Street. A mutual friend asked Ulanova to shelter Samsonova for a time due to the fact that Samsonova's apartment was being renovated, to which Ulanova agreed. Then, Samsonova lived in Ulanova's apartment for several months, helping with the housework. She began to like living in the apartment, wanting to stay there for longer and refusing to move out. Over time, the relationship between the two deteriorated, and Ulanova eventually asked Samsonova to leave. After another conflict, she decided to poison Ulanova. She traveled to Pushkin, where she managed to persuade a pharmacist to sell her a prescription drug, Fenazepam. Upon returning to the city, she bought an Olivier salad, one of Ulanova's favorite dishes, then put the pills in the salad and gave it to the unsuspecting woman. Samsonova later found Ulanova's body lying on the kitchen floor on the night of July 23 and proceeded to dismember it with 2 knives and a saw. Firstly sawing off the victim's head, she then sawed the body in half, and then using the knives, she sheared it into pieces. To take out all the bags outside of the apartment, she had to go outside and return several times. Samsonova left pieces of Ulanova's body scattered in the house. On the evening of July 26, Ulanova's decapitated body with severed limbs wrapped in a bathroom curtain was found near a pond at the house number 10 on Dimitrov Street. The package initially didn't attract any attention for several days until a local resident took interest in its contents. The identity of the deceased was established on July 27 after a survey of apartment residents. When they knocked on Ulanova's apartment, Samsonova opened the door to the authorities. Having entered inside, police officers found traces of blood in the bathroom and also fastening from the torn-off curtain. Once this was found, the pensioner was immediately arrested. She was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial and remanded for life in a psychiatric hospital. She underwent a forensic psychiatric examination, and on November 26, 2015, the results determined that she was a danger to society and herself, and therefore she was placed in a specialized institution until the end of this investigation. In December 2015, Samsonova was sent for compulsory psychiatric treatment in a specialized hospital in Kazan. She's being investigated in connection to a total of 14 murders. According to media reports, police found a diary which contained details of some of the murders. One entry, translated from Russian to English, read, "I killed my tenant Volodya, cut him to pieces in the bathroom with a knife, and put the pieces of his body in plastic bags and threw them away in the different parts of Frunzensky district." Number 3. The Cleveland Torso Murders. In the 1930s, the city of Cleveland, Ohio was terrorized by a serial killer on the loose. Over the course of 4 years, at least 12 people were murdered and dismembered by the culprit, with their remains scattered around the area. The killer seemed to be targeting drifters and people from marginalized communities, making it hard for authorities to even identify some of them. The torso murderer always beheaded and often dismembered their victims, occasionally severing the victim's torso in half or severing their appendages. In many cases, the cause of death was the decapitation or dismemberment itself. Most of the male victims were castrated. Some victims showed evidence of chemical treatment being applied to their bodies, which caused the skin to become red, tough, and leathery. Many were found after a considerable period of time following their deaths, occasionally in excess of a year. In an era where forensic science was largely in its infancy, these factors further complicated identification, especially since the heads were often undiscovered. The official number of murders attributed to the Cleveland torso murderer is 12, although recent research has shown that there could be as many as 20 or more. Of the 12 known victims, 2 were positively identified as Edward Andrassy and Florence Polillo, while a third victim was suspected to be a woman named Rose Wallace. The particularly gruesome killings left law enforcement baffled and resulted in the largest police investigation in Cleveland history. Authorities interrogated around 9,100 people during the search to find the torso murderer, as the investigation was led by famed lawman Elliot Ness. There were only 2 main suspects, Frank Dolezal and Francis Sweeney. Frank Dolezal, the Cleveland resident who at one point lived with Polillo and also had connections to Andrassy and Wallace, 2 of the victims, was arrested as a suspect in Polillo's murder. However, he later died under suspicious circumstances in the Cuyahoga County Jail while in the custody of Sheriff Martin O'Donnell. Dolezal was later posthumously exonerated of involvement in the torso slayings. The other lead suspect, Dr. Francis Edward Frank Sweeney, was a veteran of World War I who was part of a medical unit that conducted amputations in the field and at one point suffered nerve damage from a gas attack. Sweeney was personally interviewed by Ness. Before the interrogation, Sweeney was found to be so intoxicated that he was held in a hotel room for 3 days until he sobered up. Under questioning, he is said to have failed to pass 2 very early polygraph machine tests. Both tests were administered by polygraph expert Leonard Keeler, who told Ness that Sweeney was the culprit. After Sweeney committed himself to an institution, there were no more leads or connections the police could assign to him as a possible suspect. Following his confinement, Sweeney sent threatening postcards and harassed Ness and his family into the 1950s. The postcards only stopped arriving after his death. Sweeney died in a veterans hospital in Dayton, Ohio on July 9, 1964. And ever since, no one has been charged with the crimes. Number 2. The Black Dahlia Murder. The Black Dahlia case remains one of the most notorious unsolved murders in American history. On January 15, 1947, the body of 22-year-old aspiring actress Elizabeth Short was found in the Leimert Park neighborhood by a mother walking her young daughter. Not only had Short been brutally murdered, but her corpse was severely mutilated afterwards. 6 days later, Short had returned to her home in Los Angeles after a brief trip to San Diego with Robert Red Manley, a 25-year-old married salesman she had been dating. Manley stated that he dropped Short off at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles and that Short was to meet her sister, who was visiting from Boston that afternoon. By some accounts, staff of the Biltmore recalled having seen Short using the lobby telephone. Shortly after, she was allegedly seen by patrons of the Crown Grill Cocktail Lounge at 754 South Olive Street, approximately 600 meters away from the Biltmore. On the morning of January 15, 1947, Short's naked body, severed into 2 pieces, was found in a vacant lot on the west side of South Norton Avenue, midway between Coliseum Street and West 39th Street in the neighborhood of Leimert Park. At the time, Leimert Park was largely undeveloped. Short's severely mutilated body was completely severed at the waist and drained of blood, leaving her skin a pallid white. Medical examiners determined that she had been dead for around 10 hours prior to the discovery, leaving her time of death either sometime during the evening of January 14th or the early morning hours of January 15th. The body had apparently been washed by the killer. Short's face had been slashed from the corners of her mouth to her ears, creating an effect known as the Glasgow smile. She had several cuts on her thigh and breasts, where entire portions of flesh had been sliced away. The lower half of her body was positioned a foot away from the upper, and her intestines had been tucked neatly beneath her buttocks. The case quickly gained infamy as newspapers bestowed upon Short the nickname Black Dahlia and published sensationalized articles about her. In the aftermath, multiple people came forward claiming responsibility, but were eventually let go due to lack of evidence, despite a lengthy and extensive police investigation that brought forth more than 100 suspects. The true identity of Short's killer is still unknown. Now, into the very first and weirdest of them all. Number 1. The death of Sylvia Likens. This wasn't just weird, it was crazily weird. Sadly, more people should have been arrested, but we only saw one person, and her punishment was probably so little compared to her crime. Well, who is she? Gertrude Baniszewski, nicknamed the Torture Mother, oversaw and facilitated the prolonged torture, mutilation, and ultimate killing of Sylvia Likens. In July 1965, Lester and Betty Likens, who worked in a traveling carnival, asked Gertrude Baniszewski to take care of their 2 teenage daughters, Sylvia Marie Likens, 16, and Jenny Faye Likens, 15, in exchange for a week's compensation. However, if the money was late, Baniszewski would take out her anger on the girls. Over time, Baniszewski began focusing her acts of violence on Sylvia alone. It is important to note that Baniszewski was not acting alone. She was the mother of 7 children, all of whom participated in the torment and savage attacks against Sylvia, alongside several of her childhood friends. Through intimidation, her youngest sister, Jenny, was occasionally forced to participate in her mistreatment. The abuse lasted for 3 months, occurring incrementally, and tragically, in October 1965, Sylvia was brutally beaten to death. In an attempt to cover up the crime, Baniszewski allegedly coerced a neighbor into calling the police and falsely reporting that Sylvia had run away. Her autopsy showed 150 wounds across her body, including several burns, scald marks, and eroded skin. The official cause of her death was determined to be a homicide caused by a combination of subdural hematoma and shock, complicated by severe malnutrition. However, when the authorities arrived at their residence, Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, secretly whispered to one of the officers, pleading, "Get me out of here, and I'll reveal everything." Baniszewski received life imprisonment, but was eventually released on parole. She later relocated to Iowa, changed her name, and ultimately succumbed to lung cancer in 1990. As for the other individuals involved, most of whom were youngsters, they received lenient or no punishment. The torture and murder of Sylvia Likens is widely regarded by Indiana citizens as the worst crime ever committed in their state, and has been described by a senior investigator in the Indianapolis Police Department as the most sadistic case he had ever investigated in the 35 years he served with the Indianapolis Police. Perhaps the offenders should have been more punished, but that's part of what makes it weird, and it is what it is. And that's it for the top 10 weirdest murder cases. If you journeyed down here with us and you haven't done the needful, do well to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to get the very best of crime contents like this. We'll see you soon again. Until next time, peace out.